Yeah, they argue on the document. To service access translate into a routable number for an application, for example, call center. And it's also to add a new value for the parameter. So people should use and post any comments on the dispatch working group mailing list. And I always like to do this. These are the deadlines for the next IETF meeting, just to give you a heads up. Oh, okay. This one's not. Oh, the remote people, you mean?
So,
well, that's because they're still trying to set it up.
Remote people. This is Cullen talking on the other mic. If you hear us, let us know back in the Jabber room. Otherwise, we're not covering into the critical stuff yet. Make sure we have audio before we get to any of the presentations. But we're really running out of time. We're going to move forward a little bit on some of the stuff that's covered in the slide.
Oh, they do. So should we switch to that one? Okay. Okay. Is this better? Okay. People can hear. All right. Okay. So now we have a brief word from the AD, so I'll let Richard have the mic.
Since there's a late edition of the agenda, so I'll be quick. I just wanted to call out the groups we've had get finished with their working group items and closed down since the last one of these reports we did. So to the chairs and participants in CUS, DART, GeoPriv, Salute, SOC, and Drinks, soon to be, I just wanted to give a round of applause and thanks for your contributions in getting work done. So you may have seen some discussion about art on the IETF mailing list. A charter for this point in time, and we are now just reflecting these same sorts of considerations in the charters for things like dispatch and so forth. So we have time for about two comments here, and then we need to close lifelines and take us to the list. But just comments.
Keith Craig. I think you'll find that RSC 5727 has two functions. It sets IANA policy on certain IANA registrations, and it does the other action, which I think is basically what we're referring to, which is handling new work. I don't think you can make the IANA policy stuff historic.
Fair point.
Don Peterson. So did it work?
Did which work?
Dispatch. Did it work?
I mean, I think that no aspect of this proposal is about shutting down dispatch, because I think that we've been pleased with it, and we're keeping it around because I think it's been an effective mechanism. This is not about getting rid of dispatch. It's not about changing the process at all. This is about documentation.
Okay. I mean, again, the point of that document from Expo anyway, it did need to dot I's and cross T's after we killed two headers. It really was just to describe the overall new structure of I. If you're planning on keeping around the working group as is, you know, to probably do work successfully without successful 5727.
It seems to be the logical trouble with relying on charters is that dispatches for work that isn't in a working group yet and doesn't have a charter. So I'm not sure how that quite works.
Yeah, by working group charters there, I meant the charter for dispatch and the charter for SIPCOR, et cetera.
One of the big issues is how you decide what work goes to dispatch and what goes to APSA WG. So, I mean,
yeah, it's a little bit schizophrenic the way that there are sort of these expertise areas I've been thinking of it, because we have expertise in SIP and real-time stuff here. The apps area stuff has expertise in different areas. So I think that sort of topic focus areas will persist for a little while because it sort of makes sense. But that'll be something for our new AD. Welcome, Dan Campbell, to think about. So thanks for feedback, guys.
All right, so I'm going to run through just a few activities that are happening outside IETF that people might be interested in. I'm not going to read the slides. These are in the meeting materials, and people can go read about it. The SIPNOC 2015, which is a operator-focused conference, but it's talking about people that actually really use the protocols we developed here in real life. SIP Forum is working on SIP Connect 2.0, which again is applying our specifications into what people are really doing. And then there's a joint activity with Addis doing an IP and an I interface that has a lot of service providers engaged. And there's documents out there already if people want to go peruse those. Also in the IMTC, they have a WebRTC task group, and they're actually going to do some interop testing at the IMTC SuperOp event. And there's information in here. IMTC is a member-only organization. However, non-members that are interested in participating can contact Natalie here. All right. Okay. So our next slide is as Richard mentioned, Ben Campbell is our new AD. And we want to thank Richard. I need to yell. We want to thank Richard for his 2 years of service as the RAI AD. And okay.
So, Richard, we have a few things for you, as you can imagine. I found this wine that was named after the best codec ever. I'm sure it wasn't the other way around in the rye area, but we really felt you should have a bottle. So, thank you from Dispatch and the codec working group. Oh, it's an Opus 1 wine.
No, that's not us. No.
So we also have a nice Argentinian wine from the other chairs of the codec working group.
So I have been dispatched by Alyssa Cooper to present you with the following gratitude for your work with her over the past 2 years. Little via telegraph, good shetting to pop, enjoy, sir, and thanks.
And equivalently, Paul Kazivic could not be here this time around, unfortunately, but this is both of us. Thanks for everything you've done for SIPCOR. It's a Chilean wine, and I brought a care and feeding sheet because I really didn't know very much about it myself.
And this is from PDP SIP and SIPREC, and we both really appreciate your help all the way through. You've been very helpful with us. You're really good work. Thank you.
This is for, the year we spent as RICO AD, so some, Spanish stuff.
Well, I guess I'm the only working group with an appropriate name, so thank you from the drinks working group. Mostly for all the patients.
This is from XR Block. My co-chair couldn't be here, but if you still like wine after drinking all of this, you may want to pass to. Yeah.
Okay. Network's not working.
Thanks to you all. One more.
I have one more. Since I live about 1.5 miles from you, I figured there was no real point in actually, bringing it over here and then flying it all the way back. So we made this unboxing video.
No, it's just the unboxing video. I was saying, thanks. It was from WebRTC, and I wanted to point out that there was no IPR concerns that I'm aware of with this video. and because it's the real-time area, I thought that what we would do is do some real-time toasting.
Hey, which video codec did you use? So I have 160 cups.
Sean, did you submit this agenda request in time?
Latour, Mark.
I have one more.
One more.
One more.
Okay.
Okay. XMPP. We have a Chateau Margot. That's fantastic.
And where'd the mic go?
Oh, Mike, I'm sorry. This is from XMPP. That is a Chateau, I forget. I know it. Yeah, Dozak Margot.
Very old wine from XMPP. Yeah.
I think it's a 2011, right? And to make your life a little easier, we have some wine luggage. This is a case carrier with a nice styrofoam insert and a box on the inside, and it even has wheels.
Yeah.
And it's very nicely labeled with a great big red Steel Me package and a wine check and a bottle of wine on the side.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone in this room and everyone who's remote. I'll save this to yeah. So, cheers. I mean, the ADs were process stewards. We help make sure that the consensus process is working as it should, but all of the real work happens by you guys and the participants who are writing the drafts, reviewing the drafts, making the technology, writing the implementations, doing the interop, and that's what really moves the internet forward. So thank you for all your work.
Okay. You can check it again. Okay. So is this microphone, can you check to see if this one's working? Okay. Is that working for the Jabber Room? The remote? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll use this one. Okay, Andrew Allen, you are up next. And make sure and stay within the yellow pink box.
Well, I'll try if I can read it this close.
Oh, what is that? Well, let me try the next one and see if it goes. There we go.
Okay, ready to start?
Just a minute, before we get going, the chairs, we've been totally we've blown it here. Not only have we not included the booze, we've not included the blues.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead and start. Yeah. Just ignore the chaos.
I'll try and stay in the box. It's a little bit difficult to read the slides from here being so close, but okay, so the background for this work is RFC 6665 has deprecated reuse by subscribe and refer of an existing dialogue established by another method being used when a subscription could be established. However, there are many deployments that include intermediary back-to-back UAs that need to receive the refer or subscribe requests that are related to an invite established dialogue. For instance, SBCs that change the dialogues on either side and possibly modify other URIs as well. They would need to transpose target dialogue, replaces headers, etc. Before reception by the remote UAS. There's also intermediate servers, such as some conference servers that act as a UAS for refer. Even when that refer is targeted at a remote UAS, either a remote UAS that's in the conference or one that's not currently in the conference but is about to be invited to the conference. And if these requests are sent outside of the invite created dialogue, then things either don't work or as intended, or in most cases just simply don't work at all. Next slide, please. So the problem, RFC 665 mandates that when the remote target is a GRU, a request capable of creating a subscription must be sent outside of an existing dialog. And some of the discussion on the list on this seems to indicate that SBC vendors are likely to modify the contact header field so it doesn't indicate it is a GRU, or i.e. no GR parameter, which will result in the refer or subscribe then being targeted at the SBC instead of the remote UA in order to ensure that the request is sent within the invite created dialog and reaches the SBC. So basically, the work for RFC 6665 is effectively wasted. This is what Hadriel said. Basically, he assumed that they would do. And that means that dialog reuse continues. So we did a whole bunch of work and it's going to be defeated. Also, contact header field contents being overwritten. There's a lot of valuable information in there. I mean, it was always intended that GRUs would be transmitted end to end. And also the media feature tags. That the capabilities of the UA, the remote UA at the other end, are lost if the SBC start modifying these things. So next slide. So some potential solutions. So basically, in my view, what is needed is a means for an intermediary that needs to receive and manipulate or process mid-session requests to indicate that mid-session out-of-dialog requests that relate to the dialog of the session that's being established, be able to indicate a URI to be included in the route header of such out-of-dialog requests, a preloaded route basically, that will cause that request to route by the intermediary. And the draft proposes some mechanisms. There may be others. This is more of a problem draft right now, but a new SIP header field, a new RR param, a new URI parameter, new feature capability indicator, or there has been suggested that the route could be embedded in the contact URI as well. So next slide, and go just through a summary of these proposals. So we could come up with a new SIP header field, suggestion here for the name of it, OOD record route. And this contains the URI of the intermediary that the out-of-dialog requests are routed to that relate to another dialog. An intermediary would include these in the invite request that establishes the dialog and also in responses to invite. And the UA would then include the route header field containing that URI that it receives in this header field in any related out-of-dialog request it sends. Next slide, please. Alternatively, a new RR param. So a suggestion for that is OODRR. And this indicates that the URI of the intermediary for routing out of the dialog requests that relate to another dialog. It will be included by the intermediary when it includes its URI in the record route header field of the dialog, of the dialog establishing invite request. And then similarly, the UA would then include a route header field containing that URI in the record route header field that's been tagged with this parameter in any related out-of-dialog request it sends. Next slide. The URI parameters are very similar, so I didn't go into the details of this, but just use the URI parameter instead of an RR param in order to tag the URI in the record route, and then again it will be included in the out-of-dialog requests that need to be routed by the intermediary. Next slide. Another alternative, a new feature capability indicator. So suggestion here is SIP.OOD route. Contains the URI of the intermediary for routing out of dialog requests that relate to another dialog. So this OOD route feature capability indicator will be included by the intermediary in the dialog establishing invite requests and responses, and the UA would then use that URI in the route header fields for any out-of-dialog requests that are related to the dialog that it sends so that they reach the intermediary. And then another slide. So this wasn't in the original version of the draft, but was suggested on the list that you could actually have the contact URI embed the route header fields using the question mark operator. There was suggestions that, or it was claimed that if you use this approach, it might be backward compatible with existing UAs. But Brett Tate pointed out that RFC 3261 states that UAs should ignore any embedded route header fields in the contact URI.
And there may be some disadvantages to this approach. So if the contact URI is secured using S-MIME or similar means for detecting man-in-the-middle attacks, then tampering with the URI could lead to the UAS believing that the contact URI has been maliciously tampered with. Next slide. We proposed there would be some option tags so that the intermediary would know whether the UA supports this mechanism, so that the intermediary can decide to use the new mechanism or not. The intermediary might need to use SIP options in order to determine whether the UAS supports the extension before forwarding the dialog creating request, or alternatively, the intermediary might modify the dialog after discovering in a response whether the UAS supports the extension or not. And I think the last slide coming up. So I guess the question for dispatch is this a problem worth solving? Or do we continue with what looks likely that back-to-back UAs modify the contact and continued multiple dialogue usage will take place in many or even most real deployments? If we do decide we want to solve this problem, which working group would this be appropriate for? SIP core, STRAW, something else? And then obviously I'll take feedback on the potential solutions, and if people have other suggestions, I'd be interested in hearing about those as well.
Okay. Hi, this is Adam Roach. Is there anyone in the queue in front of me? No. Okay. Okay, there we go. So just to make sure that I have the scoping of this correct, you introduced this as talking about the complications introduced by 665 deprecating dialogue reuse. So that's the entire scope, right? We're not concerned about being able to route like methods or anything like that. This is basically, I want to talk about that dialogue for the purpose of subscribing to it, right?
Yeah, I'm really focusing on the problems that RFC 6665 introduced by deprecating dialogue reuse.
Right, so it's fundamentally about GRU routing. So based on that, I want to, there's a set of concerns that I have, and then I also have a set of, I think, probably solutions that require less work than this. The concern that I have is that we're setting up a system here that has basically one domain deploying some administrative policy about how they need their requests routed, and it has implications about other administrative domains, and just from a deployment perspective, that seems pretty untenable, where I've changed the way I behave, and so the rest of the world needs to adapt. I don't think that's deployable. Now, in terms of actually solving it, I agree this is a problem that needs to have something to address it. But I think we can probably do it without developing new protocol elements. We have these intermediaries that are already behaving in a way that sort of knows about routing. And I think there are probably, I could probably thumbnail 4 or 5 different ways of doing this that doesn't require any additional protocol mechanism, just policy internal to that domain that can handle this sort of thing. I mean, the most trivial one would be, because this domain is handing out GRUs to its users, those GRUs could route to some smart box that knows how to handle them, and encoded in the user portion of that, they could put these route headers, or some cookie that gets you back to those route headers, that box could then unpack, put in route headers, and route it into the domain. And that becomes transparent to the sending party. So I think that probably working around that space, where we have an informational document that says, if you want to have these behaviors, here's how you can do it, would be helpful. I think the protocol mechanisms are probably a bit overkill.
Okay, I mean, if there's other ways to solve this problem, I'm certainly open to those. I guess I'd have to think about what you're saying there, but I'm not sure if just the domain that issues the GRUs. I mean, there can be transit intermediate boxes that are not in the domain that issued the GRU as well, so it doesn't necessarily solve all the problems.
So, but those intermediary domains have to be inserted during call setup in some way, right? When I get AOR and I send an invite to it, it's going to route there, and it's going to route there by 3063 resolution rules. So just, you can reduce it to whatever that GRU is, has to have the same 3263 resolution properties as the AORs of that domain. And then you can do everything that you did in the first place.
But the GRU's only, the GRU resolution would only be the terminating domain, right?
Yeah, Robert's right. We don't need to engineer this to the microphone.
Yeah.
I am
okay,
personally...
So you think there is a problem that we ought to solve, and but you don't necessarily think that there's a protocol solution needed to do this?
Right. I think it's more of an informational description of using the tools we already have. Here's how you combine them to achieve your goal.
Was the Pac-Man display up there indicative that there was someone in the queue? Or did that?
Sorry, I can't hear you too well, John.
Yeah.
Right behind my
No,
head.
he's talking about the remote.
I saw
display.
someone in
okay.
getting Pac-Man over there. I'm not sure if that meant there was someone else in queue or not. But I was just asking, I mean, don't B2B modify the contact header and other indications for reasons other than solving this problem? Like apology hiding, policy preservation. My question is, are they actually going to stop? Or SBC going to stop doing this if we solve this particular narrow issue? If not, then it's hard for me to see why
Well,
we should.
I mean, I can't speak for SPC vendors, but right now, this is one reason why I think they will continue to do that. And the work that we did on GRU, as I understood it, was to try and avoid the issues that they were trying to override the contact header for, right?
It was an attempt to provide an alternative architecture, yes.
Yes.
And one that had that community chosen to embrace it, we'd be in a very different situation over all the SIP networks, but they obviously have not. And again, my question, if it really is just a policy issue that motivates them to modify contact header specifically, then again,
Well, I think
if anybody could speak to it, I'd be glad to hear that it's not a policy issue, but I think it's a policy issue.
I think it is a policy issue, but I think it's a policy issue that's to some extent based on historical things, right? So people come to conclusions, we need to do X. And even though the world has changed somewhat, they're still in this rut of, well, we continue to do what we used to do because there were good reasons for doing it in the past.
Okay, so nobody else is queued up, and I guess there's nobody remote. So it sounds like people think there is a problem. It might be worth working on, but the solutions proposed may not be necessary. So it's probably worthwhile to spend a little bit of time discussing on the list, and interested parties get together and see what you can come up with.
And would it be good to do a rev of this draft, take the solution material out of it, and just describe the problem statement as the first starter?
Yes, that would be really good.
Okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some actual use cases.
Use
showing what
cases,
happened.
scenarios, and stuff. That'd be great. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay.
So now we've got to switch over to our remote presenter.
So can you help us get switched over to our remote presenter? We're going to try doing a remote presentation on GeoJSON here. And this is going to be through the wonders. We'll see what happens.
What, Krista?
Is Norton Security
Just the summary of
sponsoring
it?
the session? So the summary of it was more discussion of the problem is fine. Many people feel there are already mechanisms that meet the needs of the problem. Some of the solutions, there was questions about whether anyone would deploy them. And there was not yeah, that is the summary.
Okay, preliminary, I get the latest. Can I get the latest slides? I don't have the latest slides.
They're uploaded.
No, I'm not on.
You, okay.
I'm not on the network. I'm off the network. So I would not give all you're not on the network. Okay, so I'd rather work from these because I did not get the updated ones. Okay. So how are we plugging in his audio? Okay. Okay, so we're going to get up to seeing it, Richard. Yeah.
So for people listening on the audio stream, we're going to do the GeoJSON next. It didn't seem to be really ready quite right, so we're going to do the CNET one first, and then we'll go back to GeoJSON.
All right. I'm Richard Shockey. I think some of you remember me from around here from time to time. What we want to talk about today is a discussion that we have been having on several lists for approximately 18 months or so. And Brian Rosen delightfully put together a CNET list where we started talking about this concept of calling name identity trust. the basic concept is this, is that we need the originating session would present much more trusted information about who is calling to the terminating party. And this would be some form of display of information of one form or the other, where the consumer is given more information about whether to accept the session or not based on a display from the client user agent. Now, the requirements for this are really coming out of several national authorities who have had the ongoing issues of caller ID spoofing and consumer protection. This is directly related then to things involving STIR. It is another form of this. STIR, many of us believe in and of itself is not a silver bullet for solving all the problems of caller ID spoofing one way or the other. Therefore, we need to look at a variety of techniques that actually protects consumers and protects callers within the system. In the United States here, by the way, the Federal Trade Commission gets over 250,000 complaints per month on various aspects of violations of the Do Not Call list or related frauds associated with real-time communications. So what we know, at least at this particular point, is that the original service in the PSTN was CNAM. However, that service has become broken. It is not valid either, I believe, technically and or from a business modeling perspective, but we're not dealing with that. What we have right now is a simple 15 characters worth of ASCII that is either inserted into the SIP headers at the front field or PAI. There is some work going on, which I'll describe in a little bit, about adding to that potentially 45 characters of UTF-8. Even the existing practices for the display of calling party information is not particularly well documented. The idea is that we need to document this in some way, shape, or form. We may want to look at a form, an advanced form of CNAM Plus. I'll stop for a second, allow the distinguished Martin Dolly to say something.
Okay. Martin Dolly, AT&T. With respect to existing PSTN CNAM is broken, if the CNAM query is done to the authoritative database, typically associated with a carrier, or then you're going to get the proper name associated with the subscription. It becomes broken when third parties cache CNAM information and queries are made to them, and therefore you may get misinformation. And I know why Brian is going to come.
Can I understand that, Martin, and that's the discussion point. Before we get into some of these modeling issues, let me just review the proposition, and then you can defend the indefensible. So one of the ideas that we have discussed on the dispatch list and on the CNET list has been the idea of something that is a little bit more forward-looking, an idea of CNAM Plus, which is the data would be embedded within the SIP headers or referenced in some way, shape, or form. What I think I actually can say is that there is considerable support among carriers and service providers for deploying or at least re-rationalizing this solution. I can also speak with some authority that national regulatory authorities, which in the United States would be the FCC, the CRTC, and other bodies like that, are very, very interested in anything that provides the consumer with more information about whether to make a rational decision or not, and would actually have substantial support from them as well. Next slide. So the question for CNET is essentially a chartering issue. What headers would we use? A lot of discussion has been on repurposing call info in some way, shape, or form. Do we really need a brand new header here? I would prefer not. What is the data object, whether it be JSON card, for instance, as a potential, or text? How is this totally integrated with STIR? Also making sure that there is consistency across the user agent platform, or it could be mobile, enterprise, and landline displays of one form or the other. Obviously, there are some issues with data validation, but it is my preferred outcome that we do not necessarily deal with it in a first round, and we keep it relatively minimal as well. If you how we address the problem, something like overarching where we're only dealing with the header, and we're only dealing with the data object, and we don't deal with what Mike considers politically charged issues in terms of who creates the data. The other issue that I have here, and I just is that we've already seen work in other section development organizations. My ultimate we're going to protect our integrity of this depends promote interoperability across user platforms so that you need definitive data making others have said added yes, we had a variety looking at a variety of solutions to this one, which is breach and say now also looking at this, also looking at substantial area is recording areas for so GP is now already out. So I'm asking here, what is the consistency hopefully not both in the ocean and both in the ocean, but in fact interoperability and advantages and prevention we have to do some actions for. So Mr. Peterson.
Hi. Sure. So I'm not sure all of this is all of this. Okay, so in charters working group, we can work over security, and I think there's a problem here. I think we should agree with the problem. Could you speak up? Can you hear me? They can't hear me? I can for all of this. Yeah, so I'm not saying that it's a charter issue. You can just figure out what can you use. Those are decisions and technical decisions. I think what we need to agree on first is we need to problem for what is the dimension space. And the decision space for this is involved doing some steps. There are very other networks who want to define a state header and middle and things like that. I also believe aspects of this problem space that are not going to be this step. And the question, before we get into details, says what problems should we be taking on here? If we're going to address this, I think we should have a reasonable story about how we can get information in a variety of contexts, look at a bunch of different use cases, and give that rule doesn't exceed them, right? That you have a picture of a mobile phone up there, and speaking of the seeing operator, I can see very few of it get seen. In fact, all of that information is being presented locally by your edge local or however associated name. The charter will tell you what the process is you're going to follow to get to what the data object is going to look like. We're not going to specify that as a charter. I'd like to know what the charter is in terms of what's the mandate of this group, what are the use cases it's considering. If the only use case it's considering is SIP, I think it's too narrow, is what I'm here to say. And what this says up here is that the only use case you're considering is SIP.
Martin Dolly. Okay, so with respect to the work being done on other SDOs, I mean, within the PTSC, what we're looking at is extending the length of the information, but in a query response model similar to that that's used in the PSTN for IP terminations, such that a more robust name can be presented, to those endpoints that can support the greater length than the existing circuit switch systems. Within 3GPP SA1, there is activity that's being kicked off with respect to supporting this in all mobile systems. Now, again, this is being kicked off, so we're not there yet that this is a 3GPP requirement yet. And so to that aspect, I would maybe agree with John that maybe that's premature, but I believe that will occur, but we're not there, quite yet. With respect, and that's with respect to signaling it in the call setup signaling, which at this point in time is SIP. I do agree with John that whatever mechanism that does come up, it should be able to be supported, irregardless of the call session protocol to be used, because you would want ubiquity across, independent of the device, consistency across devices. Right.
And by the way, Martin, I've certainly viewed the work at PTSC on this as potentially complementary, and that could be been brought in as well. So the fine folks at Hollow raise your hand. You were certainly responsible for a lot of the documentation for this particular concept one way or other. I mean, it's certainly a basis for discussion on to at least start with, and one way or the other. Yes, Brian.
Brian Rosen. So I'm here to talk about the data validation piece, and I'd like the charter to make sure that it can be considered in scope. We may not have to boil the ocean, but if the problem with the data we have data now, it's invalid. The whole point is to make the name valid. So we have to work on validation in one form or another.
But Brian, my point is, at this particular relatively nascent stage, is that, and you can put it in the charter, but is it biting off more than we can chew, given the way we tend to do things around here?
I claim that unless you deal with validation, you have not solved any problem. We have ways of transporting, we have multiple ways of sending names. The problem is the names that are being sent are invalid. If we don't come up with a way to have a valid name, it isn't an interesting solution.
Maybe. Yes.
So, Keith Drage, I think we were mentioning 3GPP. You've gone a step further than 3GPP have yet gone. They have various study items on how do we deal with a spoofing problem. This may be a solution to that, but I don't think 3GPP have yet got that far.
Would it be valuable, Keith, in your opinion, would it be valuable for us to at least start work like this as complementary to our 3GPP going?
I'm not saying don't do the work. What I'm saying is, if you want to reference it to 3GPP, make sure you've got 3GPP at the right status.
Right, and of course I mentioned that a liaison with 3GPP is essential here. Hollow.
Helen Murphy Erickson. Question.
Yeah.
Helen Murphy Erickson. Can you hear it now?
That's good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Question in response to Brian's point about the data not being valid. What basis do you have for that? Because today, the data that is in service provider databases is valid. So, as Martin mentioned, it's third parties that cache the data, that do not get to update the data, have stuff in there that's been sitting for years. That's the source of the problem. But I would also like to ask you, Richard, to explain what you meant with the bullet that CNAM is broken today. What did you mean by it's broke? Are you talking reliability? Are you talking that 15 is not enough? Are you talking that sometimes you get unavailable? What exactly were you thinking when you said it is broke?
It is broken in several senses. I mean, to Brian's excellent point, and one way or the other, is that the data, number one, the data set is insufficient. Two, it has not been properly validated in some way, shape, or form, except in the sort of service provider environment. There are multiple business models involved, which is not the business of the IETF, but the system itself is not providing the consumer with a robust set of data that allows them to make a decision on session acceptance in a manner that protects them from fraud. That is the conclusion of a lot of our national regulators, to be quite honest.
But if it is not the business of the IETF
Correct.
to get
We
into
understand
the business
that, but
model,
the
and we
the
recognize
purpose of the work is to start someplace that either can define the objects correctly, define a potential trust model, and then in terms of interoperability, making sure that there is consistency within the headers on how it is to be presented.
So I don't disagree with that portion of your proposal, but when the discussion digresses into what is quality data and what is not, and we say that it is not the business of the IETF, then I am not sure why we're having this about data being involved. So, Brian?
Scope is the issue.
So there are websites, I'll be happy to show you one, where you can type in any name you'd like, place a call from any number that they'll provide you with. In other words, it's a web service that'll let you place calls, and you can type in the website what you'd like to have calling name show up. There are service providers who are in the business of supplying calls, originating calls, where the name that is returned from a CNAM query is completely under control of the person making the call, and there is no validation whatsoever. It is not true that every carrier does this, but there are some. And the problem that we have is exactly the same as we are solving in STIR. The carriers that have great CNAM also don't allow spoofing of telephone numbers, but there are enough service providers who do that we have a problem. And that's the problem that we need to deal with, right? It isn't well-behaving service providers. It's not well-behaving service providers.
Actually, I think sorry, John again. I think there are well-behaving service providers that are in a very similar boat. It isn't merely a malicious problem. I mean, any level 3 that gives a block numbers to a Skype no longer knows who the customers are that are going to be associated with those numbers. They're Skype's customers. Right? And this is part of the modern STIR CNET ecosystem that we're now trying to understand of what it means to assign a number and what it means to be customer attached to it. And we need to have a more holistic view of how this architecture is going to play out. Because these are real issues. It's not just that there's a few bad apples that let you spoof things, right?
All right, John.
So, but the point of this is that the carriers do not always have the data for this. They don't.
Channeling Paul Kizabet from the Jabber, the displaying UA doesn't typically query the CNAM database itself. How does it validate that what it receives from upstream?
That is what we want to do. That's the problem solving. That is the problem we're solving.
But even in the PSTN today, which is not experiencing as many problems as we expect with the IP network, spoofing and all, there is room for the business decision whether you go with the database that gives you and you go through testing with them in order to find out how reliable their data is. So I'm not sure where you're drawing the business line in order to say.
I'm not going there at all. I mean, that is not the role of the IETF. The issue at hand is actually quite simple.
I'm not actually directing the question at you. I'm talking to Brian. Where do we?
And then we have to come to a conclusion.
Right. So we can't deal with business models in the IETF, and I'm not trying to do that. And we're not trying to separate the good guys from the bad guys in the IETF. We don't do that either. We've got a charter. The only thing that I think is important at this point is that data validation has to be somewhere in the charter. You can't just say it's out of scope for this effort, because I don't think it's interesting. That's the only thing I think we really need to deal with, is that some form of data validation has to be within the scope of the work that we're going to do. And we can work on what the details are, how we do it, and what we don't do as we go on.
But in the interest of time, let me what I am hearing, at least in my own little ear, is we actually need to do something with this, number one. It should be here in the IETF in a separate working group. We can call it whatever we want to. 3, validation needs to be in scope in some way, shape, or form. And
you're missing the other one that was made quite clearly too, is we need to be very crisp on what the problem is we're solving, which we're not yet.
right.
Right.
But it is work worth doing, and we need to, which piece?
There is work that needs to be done on the internet, no question about it.
Oh, really? Right. Well, then
I'm not hearing resound. I hear a lot of support for this problem worth doing in this space. In fact, the whole ecospace of this space. But I don't think we've nailed exactly what that is yet, or what we're going to go enough to be able to go do something about it. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from the microphone. Is that anybody want to stand up and disagree with that sort of characterization where we are? Okay.
So we need to do some cycles.
So we would like you to do more work.
All right. That's
On the charter. Yeah.
as long as there's a, I mean, how many people, do you want to do how many people would
See
like
how
to
many
work
people
on
are
this?
How many people are going to help him with this work?
Right.
Okay, we got 5 or 6 hands that are going to help him. So help him, and let's figure this out and figure out what the problem is.
That's all I need. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Where's Dan? Oh, Dan said yeah?
One from the jabber room too.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. So
Okay.
are we going to try GeoJSON again? Or?
We're going to try GeoJSON round 2.
Okay.
So, Sean, can you switch over and join us?
Okay, I got my mic on.
The other Sean.
Do you hear me?
The virtual Sean. Is he on there? Does he know?
I think I'm live. I got my video on, got the sound
we're
on.
having issues with the audio.
Okay.
So, you don't think he's going to be able to present remotely? Is that what you're saying? Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the VRS then. Brian Rosen.
Paul Kizovit isn't able to be here, so I'm going to present this for him. Go on. In the U.S. And evolving in other countries, in fact, in Sweden and a couple of other places, they have similar services that are assisted services for people who are hard of hearing. And the particular service that we're talking about now is called Video Relay Service. And it's where a deaf person uses sign language over a video phone to communicate with an interpreter who places a telephone call on behalf of the deaf user. So there's a video connection between the deaf person and the interpreter, and audio telephone connection between the interpreter and the hearing person, right? And the interpreter is doing bidirectional interpretation. So that's the service. This is a service that's available today. In the U.S., it's publicly funded. It's provided by some service providers who provide mechanics and the interpreters, and that those people are paid for by a fund that the U.S. subscribers pay into, telephone subscribers pay into, that creates money, and the providers are paid out of that fund. So the current VRS system is deployed based on 323 in the U.S., and it's trying to get moved to SIP. And there's a piece of effort involved in the SIP forum to do a SIP profile for them. But there's a problem, and it's got to satisfy some regulator issues. Next slide. And it's the problem is that there's a regulation that says that each of the providers must check the IP address of the device to see that it's in the U.S. before they can provide relay service. So this is a typical thing. It is spoofable using VPNs and other things, but it raises the costs associated with fraud high enough that the government thinks that this is a worthwhile thing to do. It's looked at it several times. The providers have been willing to do it. So that regulation is in effect, And we've got to figure out a way to pass the IP address to do that check. And go on the next slide. The complication and the reason that it's not trivial and the reason I'm standing here is that there is a way to do what we call a dial around. So you have somebody called a default provider. It's one of these providers that you choose to be your default provider. And if you don't do anything, that's the provider who will give you the interpreter for any calls. And you can place calls by direct dialing, and you can receive calls by someone dialing directly in, and that will use the default provider. But the law, that now I'm even beyond the regulation, the law itself has provisions that say that users, both ends, the hearing user and the deaf user, can choose which interpreter that they want, which provider of interpreters they want for every call. So if you remember how long distance used to work, right, you used to be able to do a per call choice dial around long distance carrier. This is exactly the same characteristic. On a per call basis, you can choose which provider provides the call. Okay, eat it up even more, no problem. So the problem when you do that is that the default provider is the guy for whom the SIP register was done and the outgoing call is going to be sent to, and then he's going to route the call over to the dial-around provider, and the dial-around provider will place the call to the hearing provider, or the other way, works the other way. If that happens, then you have the default provider in the path, and it is the provider who's providing the interpreter, the dial-around provider, who has to do this IP check, but it doesn't have the IP address of the device. All it has is the signaling that it got from the default provider. So we're looking for a way for the default provider to signal the IP address of the origination device to the provider who's providing the interpreter, the dial-around provider. It's within a closed domain. These providers only exchange calls with one another, and they know who they are, and there's some fairly, I mean, it's not great security, but it's good enough security between them. So it is a closed domain. But it has this problem, and that's the problem we're solving, is how to pass the IP address between the two providers. Yes?
Ted Hardy, 2 points of clarification. If it is a closed system where the providers know each other, does the law permit them simply to provide an attestation that the IP address that
Providing
they saw,
what?
An attestation that the IP address they saw met the regulation?
That isn't the way the regulation is written.
Okay. The other thing, does it have to be an IP address, or if one of them had already disclosed for purposes of emergency calling a location, would the location, since it demonstrates that you're within the U.S., also work?
If we could change the regulation, that would be great, but the regulation isn't written that way, and it's a question of which is easier to fix, the signaling or the regulation.
Well, so the problem that I see here is that you haven't actually described the mechanism, and obviously the work will eventually describe the mechanism that passes the IP address between one and the other.
Yeah, it's a call info header with a new purpose. That's all it is.
And how does that not end up leaking the IP address of the caller to people who were not previously party to it?
It's within a closed domain, and it's stripped if it's sent out. I mean, it doesn't actually ever get sent out because, by definition, the SIP signaling terminates at the provider that's getting the information.
Right, but it now.
Well,
I guess what I would like to see in this is some description of why this regulation's privacy considerations should trump the actual privacy considerations, because there seemed to be kind of a basic way you could say, look, this is a closed domain, they are trusted parties. If one provides an attestation with the same IP address for all of them, it doesn't seem like there's any actual change in the functioning of the system. So some description of why this is worth doing beyond some government decided to do it this way?
I'll give you the reason. The reason is that the default provider, because it is not providing the interpreter, does not have and does not want and will not accept liability for deciding whether the guy is in the U.S. or not. It's willing to provide a piece of information that it has, but it is not willing to say that this guy is in the U.S. because if it does and the guy isn't, it will have liability.
So I think you've up-leveled this a good bit from an attestation that he's within the U.S. to an attestation that the IP address was within the bounds that was discussed. So
It's willing to provide information that it has, right? It has the IP address, so it's willing to provide that. But it isn't willing to say whether that IP address is or isn't in conformity with the regulation.
So we should probably take this offline, but it sounds like a very simple database dip into the database it already has that says if it's not just a bulk provider but could provide these services itself, it's the default provider.
Yes.
That it must have this ability to.
Oh yes, it has the ability to do it. It does have the. There's no question that it has the ability to. It has the ability to do the check. Period. The answer is it can do the check. It can say yes, this guy is in the U.S. It can supply the location it believes that entity is. All of that is true. It can do that.
Okay.
It is unwilling to do that, but it can do that.
It's just an individual here. I don't want to go to my. I mean,
Right.
Isn't it legally required to? Isn't that the law?
No. The default provider does not have obligations. It is
The default obligation.
The guy that's getting the money is the interpreter.
Sure.
They're the ones that have to do the check.
But the default provider is required by law to give it to the provider of preference.
The regulation is not too clever about this, so you can't.
Well, I very carefully separated the law and the regulation here. I understand the problem.
The regulation doesn't say the default provider must supply the IP address. Right. The regulation, however, the providers are quite willing to tell each other what the IP address is. What they're not willing to do is to tell them is to interpret the data, right? Because there's liability associated with that, and they're not getting any money for the call. That's the bottom line. Yeah.
Okay, Martin Dolly. It would be interesting to see exactly where this is in what regulation. And
I can show it to you.
No, I understand. And what led to that, only because government agencies aren't perfect, and sometimes they make decisions based on things that, anyway, leave that as it may. The other point is that there seems to be some contradictions here in that this is a closed group. If it was a closed group, then I would have assumed that there is a hop-by-hop, security association associated with this. The fact that, there needs to be something that needs to be validated, implies that, maybe this isn't really a closed group, and that and that there is a security breach.
That's not true. There is sufficient security between them. They're willing to tell each other information. It really is a closed group. There's only 8 of them. So it is a closed group.
This is Ted Hardy again. I kind of don't care that it's a closed group, honestly, because the fact that these might be the original target users of this does not mean that they would be the only eventual users of this.
Right. I'm well aware of that.
And the idea that you say there is sufficient security among them is not a description that gives me the warm and fuzzy feeling that I love to have.
I understand that, and that's there. I think we can do something. Right? We can in the security sections for any document that came out of any work that we did here, we could say the appropriate IETF appropriate things for that environment. It's this that if there is no other solution that it runs. I mean that we can do.
So let me summarize what I hear, and I understand that your point of view is different. What I hear is you'd like the group to create a solution engendered entirely by silly regulations that didn't understand the actual mechanism that they were regulating, that then creates the possibility of passing this information, that then we wish to stop other entities from using to pass this information with text and a security consideration.
I understand how you got to that description. I think it is inaccurate. I think that it is a reasonable environment to not require that entities that don't have liability get that liability. That is an issue that we sometimes deal with, and there is the privacy related issues of that need to be properly dealt with, and I agree with that. The difference between in this environment and the environment that we're discussing, and we can make it be so in the document for other purposes. The point is that the user could have placed the call through the default provider and has asked by signaling from it to place a call to the through the other provider. So it is informing both its default provider and the dial-around provider that it wishes to place this call, and therefore it should be willing and to reveal its IP address from one provider to the other. I mean, it could put the header on itself, except that people wouldn't believe that. So I really do think the privacy issues are not as strong as you think.
Well, so the ultimate kind of question comes down to who sends the media, right? Because if you're emitting the media from an IP address and you can check the media because you're receiving the media at the VRS, if the media address tells you that somebody's within the United States, this seems to be a solved problem. If the media itself is also transiting the default provider, I think you don't have a privacy story that will hold up beyond there are only 8 of them and they have a pinky swear.
The media is problematic because the media has the SBC issue, but the flow is the same.
Yeah, we can go back to a previously unsolved problem with a different privacy issue, but that doesn't solve the privacy issue.
No, it doesn't.
So let's, because Ted was up, but Paul K. has a question or probably a comment to make.
Okay.
In the Jabber room. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Well, I think that was Paul K. Do we want to, I don't know if we want to practice the audio thing. Did he drop out? Oh, we took it back. Okay. Okay, so maybe Brian. So Brian, you have like 7 slides left and
yeah,
like
well,
6 minutes. So,
I mean,
yeah.
all of this is more on the solution. Go on to the next one.
Yeah.
This is
Okay.
you have SBCs in the path, so you can't use the media addresses. They do have turn in some environments. There's a lot of original H323 that means it's going to go through gateways. We can get the gateway to do the right thing because we have the control over the gateway, but it is a gateway. It's not exactly the device itself. And contact is really a problem. We thought about putting it in contact. That would actually work if contact would survive, but unfortunately it won't in the environment that it is. The suggested solution is call info with a new purpose. And then we can talk about whether that, and we were not tied to that, by the way. We'll deal with a new header and all that stuff. But the draft suggests call info with a new purpose. It could be any scene, but it'll contain an IP address. It'll be SIP colon the IP address. Next. So clearly there are privacy concerns, and it will remove them at the end. I mean, the call actually terminated. It will not go any farther. But even if the leg from the user to from the interpreter to the hearing user was SIP, it still is 2 separate calls. It isn't one call. It's 2 separate calls. And there's quite a bit of trust between the providers. I mean, they trust each other, but they won't take each other's liability. Next. We considered other possibilities for the solution. A new header is always possible. It just seemed easier to do a purpose, and we don't really care. Is that what it?
Well, the how to proceed.
Oh yeah, how to deal with this. That is not working.
That one doesn't work. You should have just sat up here.
Just one comment. Call info is one of the most stripped headers by SBCs. That might be a real argument for making a new header that was explicitly for this.
The thing is that the SBCs are in control of the providers. It's just that they are there. They are run as B2B UAs. They do in fact terminate the media, but we can configure them to pass the header. That isn't the problem.
You can configure them to pass whatever's in the call info header. Most of them today don't support, anyway, never mind.
Well,
I'm way off on the detail. I think when you go and look at the actual existing Acme SBCs, you might.
Right. Yes, you can configure everything. I can't do it. I see. Okay.
I don't believe your statement saying that the SBC can not strip this if it has a rule to strip it for all calls.
That's what he said.
That global statement isn't right.
Okay. Maybe we need a new header, but then they'll.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah, we'll come up with a solution as long as we accept the problem.
Yeah, this is Rich Shockey. Certainly this does not require a new working group. This is relatively simple. There are issues that need to be, resolved one way or the other. But if this can be done essentially on a mailing list, for instance, one way or the other, and ultimately put forward as AD sponsored?
If it's done as a call info purpose, I'll have to go look at what the registration is, but maybe we could do an informational. But if it's a new header, it would require a standards track, and that would require working in a working group. Well, right. We'd prefer to do it in SIPCORE. Then the ideal would be to dispatch this to SIPCORE from our point of view.
Well, yeah, what actually is your preference here? Just do it in SIPCORE as a...
Yeah. Yeah, because the privacy issues are big. Doing this informational and not having an actual group for people to come and raise their concerns and get them addressed we don't think is a good idea.
So Keith Drake.
It's really hard to hear, but I'm trying.
Well, I'm trying here.
Go ahead.
I have a concern that you seem to have based this entire step forward on one regulatory domain in one part of the world.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, what happens when the next regulatory domain comes along with a slightly different problem that you now no longer have solved? I don't think the IETF is built in the business of building solutions for one national administration.
I understand your point of view, but I think if you think in terms of what regulation could they reasonably write that would solve the problem, it would be tough to come up with one that's better than what they have. They could write it better.
As the person who actually started the SIP Forum VRS task force that really came up with this central problem, let me put it to you this way. The problem is that the video relay service as it is currently constituted globally has tended to be H323 based. This is the first effort anywhere to try and move the service to a SIP-based platform. It is the Brian's co-chair for this particular task force in the SIP forum is European. It was always the intention of starting this out that this would be the baseline profile for a SIP-based VRS that would be internationalized. So that really addresses Keith's point. It is not necessarily North American specific.
Krista Holmer, just a question regarding the scope. So if we're making a mechanism in order to provide the IP address, is the scope only for this particular service, or would this be a generic mechanism that anyone could use? Anyone that needs to know the IP address of the UE could
we would not write a VRS specific system. This would be if you have a close. I mean, we would have the security considerations would define the scope of use, right? Because that's the issue here is the security problem. Yeah. But no, I don't think we would only use. In the document we're proposing to create, VRS would be an example.
Bernard Abova, Microsoft. I'm not going to comment a lot on the specific draft, but I will say that the issue you're describing here is just one of a bunch that would need to be dealt with to actually have not only an interoperable VRS, but one that works correctly with 911 and other emergency services. And I know I'm maybe driving towards boiling the ocean, but actually this has been cited as a major problem with emergency service, the fact that it's not clear how to make the calls. So I'm definitely not against what Brian is saying. I'm just thinking that this may be actually quite a bigger problem, and the SIP forum is likely to bring up a whole bunch of stuff, and so chartering it piece by piece may not be the best thing. My opinion, this may end up requiring a new working group. But
thank you for raising that, because it jogged up a thought that I had said when we first thought about this particular effort at SIP Forum, which is that think of this as passing the original identity of the caller, where the identity in this case is a SIP URI in a particular form. And the existing identities, the from
Sean,
and the to need to be,
okay, good.
you know, the
Because
normal
we
SIP
froze the
URIs
mic.
need to be
Good.
obtained, and for whatever reason, contact is
But I
not
am.
working. You need another way to pass identity. Contact doesn't work for reasons we know, B2B UAs, et cetera, and in this case, we need some other form of passing an identity. And that is the thing that probably does have implications in other environments.
So Keith Drake again.
Okay,
We're cutting the line after Ted.
Yeah, I disagree with Richard. I've heard nothing yet that says solving a North America or United States problem even solves the problem for other people in the world, other regulators in the world that have a similar problem. I think you need to start out by saying, if we're going to do this, it needs to be based on regulations from more than one country. Thank you.
This is Ted Hardy, and I put in the Jabber chat room something which I now realize from your later statement is completely wrong, because what I put down was that you were trying to use a big I internet mechanism to solve a problem for 8 people who could get in a closed room and pass the information among themselves on chits of paper if they wanted to. Your second statement at the mic that in fact you would not create it for those 8 people, but you would create a generalized mechanism for this, and the VRFs would be a single use case, tells me I don't think this is ready, because you actually then need to describe both what those use cases are and what the security properties of this trust domain looks like, and demonstrate that there is actually a greater than single trust domain in which this is sufficiently similar problems that it's worth doing. And at the moment, the VRF case, I don't think that you've described raises to this level.
Andrew, we close the queue, yeah. Dean, we close the queue if you're getting ready to go to the microphone. He's not. Okay, sorry. Psych, okay. So I guess, well, a fundamental question would be whether or not people think there is a problem to be solved here if there's work to do, right?
Right. That's the fundamental. I mean, we can come up with solutions and we can come up with appropriate statements, but is there a problem to be solved?
Right. So let's do a hum on that. Okay, so
let me rephrase this carefully. How many of you would like to see the IETF solve this problem? And not tied to any solution, but, you know, as we currently sort of have it scoped, right?
Yeah.
Again,
I know, Keith, that
we'll read the slide.
The United States regulators problem, or a general problem that might be applying this, asking, do other people around the world have this problem as well?
Do you want a United States regulator to mandate in a report in
So
order?
let's just be clear here for a second. I mean, our IETF process more or less bans us doing a U.S.-only solution, right? I mean, we all realize this. This is the essence of this thing here. So if I expand the scope of the question to who'd like us to see a solution to this, you know, recognizing the normal privacy concerns of the IETF and international concerns of the IETF, who'd like to see us work in that space, I imagine I'll get a yes to that. Is that, should I run that one, or Ted, you think that's the wrong question? It's not what was proposed here yet. So what's the right question? Mary and I have been talking about this for 5 minutes. We're struggling.
Chris, I think if you want to get, if you formulate the problem is we need a solution in order to provide the IP address or the identity of the user, right? Then you don't need to talk about regulators or anything. You just say we need a way to provide a identity of the user.
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with the identity of the users. It's about the location of the users, and
well, the IP address of the user, if you want
an
to be,
IP address. I mean,
well, I mean, if you want to be more specific, you talk about the IP address. But I think, I mean, there were some of the existing solutions provided here. But for example, I think, for example, PS-certed identity, I don't think you mentioned that. For example, is there a reason why that doesn't work, and so on? So maybe it would be good to get some more information about that also, why that doesn't work, because obviously that requires to have something in the network which asserts it. But I think what you said is that, for example, SBCs already need to have some kind of knowledge about this, so maybe those are the ones that would actually assert identity and so on. So, but maybe you've already thought about that, but I don't think there was nothing in the slides about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so look, here's my proposal. I'm going to forward 2 questions, which is, first question, and Mary and I go forward 2 questions. First question is, should we keep working on refining this problem, figuring it out, and figuring out what sort of solution spaces we might be able to do? Who believes we should do that, and who believes we shouldn't do it? I'll do both should and shouldn't. And then I'm going to ask a question about where we might do that work. Okay? So this isn't, I'm not accepting the problems. We're not accepting the problem statement as presented here. We're saying we're going to keep working on figuring out what the problem is and what we can do with it, okay? So who is in favor of the IETF continuing work on this, refining this problem and then leading to a solution of it? Those in favor, hum now, please. Those opposed? Wow, I think that was weakly opposed from what I heard up here.
Yeah.
It's too hard to hear the noise.
Well, let's do hands then. Let's do hands.
I hate doing these things 2 in a row, but yeah. Does anyone
From
want to
back
say?
here, it was clearly the other way. So
What's that?
From back here, it clearly sounded the other way.
It sounded the other way? Okay. Okay, I'll do that with hands then, since it was unclear in different parts of the rooms. Those who wish to work on this problem, please raise your hand now. You count.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've seen 5, 6 hands. 7. Okay.
You call it 7. Any in the Jabber room?
I look at Paul's in.
Paul is. We're going to count Paul. Okay, and those who don't believe the IETF should, those who don't believe other people at the IETF should work on this. Okay. 2. Okay, and from the location, I understand we got the 4 and the against. That's why we heard it wrong up here.
Well, I think
we know why, Ted. Yeah. Okay, we're on time. So the next question is
where?
Where?
Well, Ronnie wants for the notes. There was a preference for doing the work, solving this problem.
Refining
Correct.
the problem.
Refining the problem statement. Right. Right. Okay. Right.
Now, I think the next question is this is going to, this is complicated enough. I can't imagine this not ending up in the end either in SIPCORE or in a new working group. Okay, I think that realistically that's really the options we're talking about. So, given that, what I would like to propose here and see if we can get consensus around is before Adam gets to the mic, I want to propose that we send this to SIPCORE, and if they later decide that it should go back to a working group, no, he's shaking his head. If he later decides it should go back to a working group, we can send it back to dispatch. So, comments on that proposal?
Sorry, Adam Roach, as chair of SIPCORE, I want to make sure that when you say that you're aware of the fact that you are implying we're going to have to change the charter because we don't do extensions.
Actually, it's worse than that. I mean, we're not even saying it'd be an extension at this point. You're going to be discussing the problem, much less the solution.
Yeah, that's also not. I mean, this would be a new working group unless you want to change what SIPCORE is supposed to do.
Okay, I think that's fair enough to reject that proposal at this point in time. Then, great.
Okay, so Martin Dolly, it's still I know we did a hum raise of hands. It is not clear to me what it is we were doing a poll on. Yeah, we say this work.
Refining the
What is exactly this work? I mean,
I think that's clear. The problem. We don't find it clear. So that we were very clear.
We have
the work was to refine the problem.
A better problem statement.
Yeah. So Keith Drage here, I think you need another round in dispatch, and I think basically what you need to do is you need to identify basically a charter description, even if it does not result in going to another working group. That charter description will at least scope what you're trying to do.
That's not a bad idea.
Okay, so look, I think we're that's the only, in fact, we've eliminated all other possibilities. So short of telling you guys to I don't know, go to ITU,
No.
We would like you to bring us back a charter proposal.
We accept.
Excellent. So we will see you same place next time with a much crisper problem, more people arm wrestled, and a charter.
I think you asked for something in the range of a charter, proposed charter. Yeah. Whether it gets done in a separate work group or some other work group, I think that's a reasonable thing.
Yeah. Work for people as a conclusion? Okay. We are going to try 3 at GeoJSON.
Okay, am I on?
Remote audio.
Yay!
Excellent.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, everybody. Can I launch right in?
Go right ahead.
Yes, go right ahead, and we got 20 minutes or so.
Okay, so if you go back to the title slide. Yeah, so thanks again for attending, and Mary, Colin, and Lorenzo, thanks very much for making this remote presentation possible. I really appreciate it. Thanks also to Richard Barnes and Alyssa Cooper for getting this rolling. I'm going to make the case here for forming a working group to standardize the GeoJSON format. It's an existing format that's already out in the world and getting used. There's much benefit in standardizing it for not a lot of additional work. Next slide, please. All right, so GeoJSON solves the problem of a lack of a way to describe geographic information in JSON at the time it was written. And it solves another problem in that GIS formats have traditionally been evolving towards more and more complex forms. So GeoJSON is about simplifying these problems as much as possible, but no further. And the simplification here it's not an XML versus JSON issue. It's an issue of geographic information system architecture. So there's the trend of complexity in GIS towards making more and more complicated formats that are rather tied to specific protocols. So GeoJSON is deliberately more simple and not just a JSON translation of other complex formats. Next, please. The format's coming up on its 7th birthday. Building consensus and writing it up took a little over a year. The process we used was copied largely from IETF processes. And we had committed ourselves to working openly on it and tried to put empirical results ahead of theory. And I think we did a very good job at the first and not always a excellent job at the second, which is something that we would like to address in a working group. Next slide, please. And maybe we can skip over the next 2 images, perhaps, to save a little bit of time. So GeoJSON has made it easier to design and develop applications for capturing data and applications for managing and sharing data. It's very widely used and has good to first class support in geospatial software. That includes proprietary products as well as open source projects. And there remains demand for improvement from the GeoJSON format. I could use GitHub as an example there. It's a popular site for sharing and curating GeoJSON, but because GeoJSON isn't a real standard, GitHub support is a little variable in quality. So for GitHub takes IETF standards like HTTP and JSON very seriously. They have APIs that are good at using HTTP methods, etc. GeoJSON is treated less properly. Support is not nearly as good. So this is a problem. People want GeoJSON to play a role in their infrastructures. They want to build on it. They want to extend it. They aren't sure how to do this. An RFC will make a huge difference. And a working group, I think, is the way to get to that RFC. Some users are even prevented by legislation from using, informal standards like GeoJSON. Right. So this is the major problem that we face at the moment. Next slide, please. Yes. GeoJSON is informed by open geospatial standards. I've mentioned simple features specification there, and strongly influenced by ATOM, the ATOM format. Next slide. So GeoJSON independently discovered some of the keywords later discovered by the W3C's RDF working group. I'm mentioning that there as a related work, and we're mindful of JSON LD now and are avoiding duplication of its work since it has been published. And we're in contact with schema.org principals and are working towards interoperability with that project. Next slide, please. There is now a new W3C OGC spatial data on the web working group, and some of you may have seen the announcement of this. It's in their charter specifically that they're not developing new technologies, And also mentioned in their charter is that they are considering GeoJSON as a format to recommend in their best practices. So GeoJSON standardization helps their cause a great deal, and I fully expect members of that W3C OGC working group to participate in future GeoJSON working group discussions. Next, please. So this is a list of the kind of customers for GeoJSON. Among the most interesting ones, we understand that if you make, say, apps for mobile, Apple's mobile devices, that if any of those have a spatial component, you're supposed to publish a GeoJSON file that explains the coverage of these mobile apps, so you don't try to find routing outside the coverage of the application, for example. And excuse me, next slide, please. Now, when we seek to standardize GeoJSON, I think the obvious choice was to go with the Open Geospatial Consortium, the OGC, for it. So that's the obvious choice to do. I think the authors of the format agree that the IETF is probably the better body to do this in. The lack of formal standardization, as I mentioned before, is a big problem. And some developers have kind of expressed to me the situation as having to brown bag GeoJSON within their enterprises because it's not an official standard. The IETF, pardon me, we agree with the IETF's principles. We think it's a great suit for GeoJSON. Next slide, please. So for the scope of a working group, I think we would like it to be as narrow as possible, and it's still wide enough to be useful to people. Our ID already contains many fixes and clarifications and improves significantly on the original specification. So there's quite a bit of work that's already done on it. The other things we would like to do are document best practices we've discovered since 2008. Much of the things, the way we do on the web and the internet has changed since then. There's investigate implications of recent RFCs and align with text sequences and IGs. Next, please. Remaining work. Yes, thank you. The bulk of the remaining work is working on the extensibility of the GeoJSON format. I mentioned before, possible extensions include adding temporal considerations to the format, applications towards physical routing, on street networks, etc. Things like that. The GeoJSON needs to be extended to work in those situations. And certainly, in a working group, I predict that we will have to consider or reconsider the inclusion of other geometry primitives. So since GeoJSON was published originally, there's a little more interest in curves and other kind of geometries. This will come up and we'll have to discuss it. We'll probably also have to reconsider coordinate systems. This was something that there's consensus among the GeoJSON authors that we got wrong initially and did in a kind of a more of a theoretical way and not as empirical as we'd like to have done. And so this will need to be reconsidered. All of the original GeoJSON authors approve of doing this remaining work, and of the 6, 5 of them raised their hands to actually do the work. So I think we have excellent consensus in our informal working group on getting this work done and commitment to actually do the work. Let's see. And then the last slide has links. Thank you very much.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Okay, John Peterson's queued at the microphone. Yeah.
John Peterson. Yeah, thanks. And we've certainly experimented with a lot of geographical information formats and such here in the IETF for some time. You pointed to some of the previous work, like that GeoURI that came out of the GeoGrid working group. We had this long-time mandate, and I guess I feel like we at least need to discuss it, especially in light of the fact that, if anything, the IETF has become more privacy sensitive in the last year or so than it's been in the past. We perceive we have this mandate to apply some sort of strict privacy controls whenever we're going to share geographical information in a way that might compromise an actual real person's location in the world. I took a look at the draft document. I note that, for example, it doesn't have a privacy consideration section. There is a security consideration section, but I don't think it meaningfully engages with the questions that I think motivated us to overreact. I think it's fair to say we probably overreacted in the way that we approached this initially, but the pendulum can swing too far here. And I think we probably need to say something about this in a specification like this if it should go forward. I don't know if this needs to be part of a charter of any effort that we're going to describe here as it was with GeoPriv, but I think it probably needs more attention than it's getting today.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the overreaction. Are you saying the overreaction was the chartering of a geoprivacy working group?
Sorry, so let me wind back the history clock here to probably 2000 or so. There was a group that was called Spatial that was proposed as a bot here in the IETF. And the point of this was actually going to be to have an object format to share coordinates for geographical locations, very, very similar, I think, to what you're proposing. And at the time, the steering group of the IETF rejected this and said that they would not permit a working group to be chartered in the IETF unless it had a much stronger set of privacy controls associated with the distribution of an object that might compromise a real user's location in the world. To say if you're pervasively monitoring traffic, right? If you were to share these things in the clear, you'd be able to pick it up. Now we jumped through a lot of hoops, and this is the overreaction I was referring to, in order to satisfy what we perceived the requirement to be. And in so doing, we probably created an object format that was much less useful than we hoped initially. So I wouldn't propose that we apply the same bar to this work. However, I think there has to be some amount of consideration of privacy associated with this. Again, I mean, in the web world, shared specifically over HTTPS, which I think is reasonable to assume for virtually all the use cases you're concerned with, this won't be a big deal. But we need to at least talk about that we've thought about it and what it means, what we're trying to protect, and how we propose to do it.
Brian Rosen. So you mentioned in the in your slide had a reference to the prior work that we've done on location objects and the GeoURI thing, you kind of whizzed past that as, yep, we know it's related. The problem that I have with starting another piece of work that proposes to do something that's close but not exactly the same thing as the GeoURI is that we're using the GeoURI in things that matter a lot, like emergency calling. And if we create non-compatible ways to note your location and start using them in some environments and can't use them in other environments and go the other way for those, we're going to create problems on the internet that we don't want to create. So either we need to collapse these two things into one or come up with some really good reasons why we can't do that.
Brian, Cullen's the chair here. My interpretation reading this stuff was not so much it had anything to do with location as much as describing geographic things like polygons and regions and sections and things like that, not about indicating the location of a person or any other point. So I didn't see it the same as URI. Maybe I just didn't look at it that way. But.
Yeah, well, yeah, right.
Well, Richard,
the
explain
geo part of
that. Go to the microphone, Richard.
Yes.
So we can hear.
Maybe we need to be careful about it. I think that it's really hard to separate those things in the ways that I think we're talking about. And if you pass a description of something to an application, that application might then use it as a way to represent where somebody is when they know, oh, well, this is what this building is. Oh, I'm in that building, therefore I am here. And if we create incompatible ways of representing that kind of thing, we'll likely be in trouble.
Okay.
This is Richard Barnes. So thanks, John, for presenting this. I think this is really interesting work. To John's point about privacy, I think that it is important that we keep an eye on the ball here and make sure that the privacy considerations around this stuff are documented. I think there's been some good guidance from the IESG and the IAB on writing privacy considerations and sort of risks that need to be taken into account. And I think that the text can be crafted that addresses those in a spec of this character. One of the things that I think is really useful about the prior art that we flipped through in some of these earlier slides, like the GitHub gists, is that it demonstrates that there's a lot of use cases where geo is getting embedded as Colin was sort of suggesting, as a description of other things that are not that are often public and have very minimal privacy concerns. So I think we have gotten some more experience that can help inform that privacy considerations discussion and make it a little more balanced than we've done in the past. So to Brian's point about interop, I haven't looked at GeoJSON in a little while, but I believe that it is largely draws on a lot of the same concepts that GML, which is the core of the GeoCurve location formats. So I'm actually not too worried about compatibility between those. Really, the space of concepts in this geo stuff is fairly limited, and GeoJSON has a history of touching, using GML as a touchstone, and so I think that I have high hopes for interop. It's again, it's something I think that we should keep an eye on as this work progresses, but I don't think it's a blocker.
Brian Rosen, I didn't want it to be a big deal. I wanted it to be an item that we maybe put in the charter, or that consideration of the interaction between what we did in GeoPriv and this work is important for things like emergency calling, and we need to be aware of those issues as we go through and do this work if we agree to go ahead. That's all I want.
Okay.
So most of the comments that have come up are about this relation of things and the things we need to consider seem reflective of things that would probably need to be reflected into the charter, and we don't have we have a very draft charter at this point, not a complete charter. So I'm sort of given we have some people that want to do this work and move it along. I've also gone and asked the authors about, is there any issues with, change control being passed to the IETF? There's no problems with that. I've asked if they're aware of any patents on it. They're not aware of any. I think that those things are basically all right. We can go through those in more detail later. I'm proposing that we should we should work on a charter for this on the list, and then call for adoption of it on the list coming up sometime in the next few weeks or months over the next little while. Is this anyone sort of object to that as a plan moving forward? Okay, sounds good then. I think we'll go talk to all 3 ADs and we'll do this. Thanks. I think with that, we are pretty much over for the meeting. So thank you. See you in Web Push, yeah. Oh, just a minute. No, I blew it. There's one thing I'm supposed to tell you. We have a survey about the remote query. I have a link, and we'll post it to the Jabber Room and the email list. So there is a little short survey about our latest interaction system here, which the folks would love you to fill out. We'll send out the links to both people. You can to both the room and the email list, and take 30 seconds and do it. Thank you all. And will somebody please pour me a drink?
Drink only break, no cookie break. Right. Hey, I got a drink. Yeah.